They thought they could just walk onto my land and tear down my fence without consequences, I muttered under my breath as I stepped off the gravel path into the cool shadow of the pine trees. Before we start the story, leave a comment telling us where you are watching from, and at the end don't forget to rate the story from 0 to 10, enjoy the story. The smell of fresh cut wood and earth filled the air, mixing with the faint scent of pine sap and morning dew. Sunlight broke through the branches, casting thin, jagged beams across the forest floor where the remnants of my carefully built fence now lay scattered in a chaotic line. My name is Ethan Carter, and this 120-acre property has been in my family for 3 generations, a place where my grandfather taught me how to track deer and my father showed me the rhythm of the land. The tall pines and dense underbrush weren't just scenery, they were living witnesses to years of care, sweat, and late nights spent maintaining the land. Just yesterday, I had walked this same path, inspecting the fence posts I had treated with linseed oil and tightened to withstand storms, and now here I was watching them splintered and knocked over as if time itself had reversed, erasing the work of decades. In the distance, I could hear the faint hum of a white SUV idling, Brenda's vehicle, the HOA president who had decided that my property lines didn't matter, parked just beyond the tree line like a predator surveying its territory. Her footsteps crunching on the undergrowth were deliberate, almost theatrical, the faint click of her heels contrasting with the earthy scent of pine and moss. The metallic tang of the nails I had hammered in last season still lingered in my nostrils, a sensory reminder of the labor she had just undone. Birds scattered with sharp, urgent chirps, startled by the intrusion, wings beating against the thin air that smelled faintly of resin and autumn leaves. My boots sank slightly into the damp soil as I moved closer, the sound of shifting gravel and fallen branches underfoot punctuating the tension that clung to the forest. Each step I took felt measured, aware of the delicate balance between the life thriving here and the destruction that had just been wrought. I paused by the first broken post, running a hand over the rough splintered wood, remembering how I had driven the stakes deep into the earth last summer, the sweat stinging my eyes, the air thick with the scent of oil and pine, and how proud I had felt as the fence line stretched across the ridgeline, marking not just property but a promise to the land itself. Looking up, I caught sight of Brenda standing near the edge of the clearing, her posture rigid, her gaze calculating, like she was assessing a chessboard instead of a living forest. The sun glinted off the windows of her SUV, the glare sharp enough to make me squint, mixing with the faint smell of her perfume that floated through the air and clashed with the natural aroma of damp earth. I could hear the faint trickle of a creek nearby, the water moving steadily over stones, the sound a quiet contrast to the deliberate destruction surrounding it. Leaves rustled under a gentle breeze, whispering through the trees, carrying with it the earthy smell of pine needles and fallen leaves, as if the forest itself was watching, holding its breath. I clenched my fists, feeling the rough texture of the soil beneath my nails, the small cuts from bark and brambles reminding me of the countless hours invested here. And in that moment, I knew this wasn't just about wood and wire, it was about respect, history, and the silent voice of the land speaking through me, waiting for the right time to respond. The first time I walked this stretch of forest alone, I remember the crunch of pine needles beneath my boots and the sharp, clean scent of morning air filling my lungs. My name is Ethan Carter, and this land is more than acreage, it is a chronicle of generations, a living diary written in soil, wood, and water. My grandfather planted the tallest pines that now tower over the underbrush, teaching me patience as we measured the growth year by year, marking each with careful notches in bark that I still remember. My father continued the tradition, showing me how to balance ecology with stewardship, how to walk quietly so that deer and foxes did not flee, and how to identify subtle changes in soil moisture that hinted at spring runoff or drought. The stream that snakes through this property has always been a constant companion, its gentle rush providing a soundtrack to my mornings, a rhythm I follow when inspecting fence lines, irrigation ditches, and the small wooden bridges connecting the hilly terrain. Every structure I built, every post I set, was done with purpose, with the knowledge that this forest is alive and that each action leaves a trace, a footprint, a story. Walking through the clearings, I recall the late afternoons when I measured soil composition for planting new saplings, the metallic tang of the hand trowel mixed with the earthy aroma of turned earth, the faint smell of resin from sap that stained my gloves. Even on the coldest mornings, when frost clung to needles and the ground cracked under my boots, I felt a rhythm, a sense that this land and I had an unspoken understanding, a partnership built on respect and time. I remember the old barn at the edge of the property, where tools and seeds were stored, its timber worn but strong, each beam telling a story of storms weathered and seasons past. On windy days, the whistling through the cracks in the barn echoed like distant voices, reminding me of the people who came before me and the care they invested in this place. The cabin near the creek, my sanctuary for planning and observation, always smelled faintly of cedar and machine oil, a combination of nature and work, reflecting the dual life of a steward and craftsman. In these moments, I would pause to listen, a woodpecker tapping in the distance, the faint shuffle of small animals through fallen leaves, the murmur of water over rocks. The forest was alive with subtle motion, and I was attuned to it, aware that every decision I made rippled outward. This land is not just a plot on a map, it is a legacy encoded in trees, rocks, and streams, and it has shaped who I am. Every morning, stepping out from the cabin onto the uneven paths, I feel the weight of responsibility, the pulse of history beneath my boots, and the quiet reassurance that protecting this land is not only my duty but a privilege. Here, the sunlight slants through the canopy in golden threads, highlighting patches of moss and the rough texture of bark, painting a picture that is uniquely mine. This property has taught me to see the details others overlook, to appreciate the complex web of life that thrives in the shadows of giants, and to respect the rhythm of growth and decay, of life and continuity. Every decision I make, from planting new saplings to reinforcing old fences, is informed by the countless hours spent observing, learning, and living within these boundaries, a testament to the enduring connection between caretaker and forest. Brenda appeared at the edge of the clearing just as the sun dipped lower, her white blazer bright against the deep green of the pines. She carried a clipboard, tapping the edge with a polished fingernail, a rhythmic sound that echoed across the undergrowth. Her presence seemed calculated, the faint scent of her perfume mixing strangely with the earthy aroma of the forest, as if attempting to assert authority over the natural world. I watched silently, boots pressed into the soft soil, aware of the subtle shift in the air, the quiet tension between human intent and the life thriving among the trees. Her gaze swept the fallen fence, lingering on the posts I had meticulously aligned, as though judging every angle, every line. I could hear the distant rustle of small animals disturbed by our intrusion, the flutter of wings, the quick patter of tiny feet over leaves, and it reminded me that the forest was alive in its own way, separate from any human claim. I remembered last spring, measuring each post, checking soil moisture and rot resistance, applying the correct sealant to ensure longevity, feeling the rough wood grain beneath my gloves, and knowing that every detail mattered not only for security but for the harmony of the property. Now, each broken piece of timber under Brenda's gaze seemed to contradict the time and care invested, but I remained calm, observing. She walked slowly along the line, clicking her pen against the pages of the HOA notes she had brought, marking imaginary infractions and speaking softly to herself in that clipped tone she used to command attention without needing anyone else present. The sunlight shifted, highlighting the damp patches in the soil where the fence posts had been, revealing the subtle variations in the ground that only someone familiar with the land would notice, details that Brenda did not see, details I carried with me and would use. I stepped forward, brushing past a low-hanging branch, the smell of pine resin strong in the air, feeling the uneven terrain beneath my boots, noting the way the light caught the texture of the moss and the lichen clinging to fallen logs. Every movement of Brenda seemed choreographed, deliberate, but disconnected from the deeper patterns of the land, unaware of the rhythms that govern growth, drainage, and the small ecosystem thriving beneath our feet. I recalled evenings spent cataloging these patterns, the way shadows shifted over the creek, the sounds of frogs and insects rising in chorus at twilight, the subtle shifts in humidity that signaled rain. These observations had taught me patience, the value of preparation, and the quiet satisfaction of understanding my environment in a way that was invisible to casual onlookers. Watching her, I understood that her actions were temporary, surface-level intrusions on something far more enduring. As she straightened up and adjusted her clipboard, glancing back toward the main road, I felt the pulse of the forest beneath me, the continuity of care and legacy that could not be undone by human gestures alone. Each fallen post, each mark she made on paper, was just a surface ripple in the ongoing life of this land, a life I had learned to read, respect, and protect. By mid-morning, the forest light had shifted, casting longer shadows that stretched across the uneven terrain and highlighted the subtle undulations of the ground where the fence had once stood. The crisp scent of pine mixed with the damp earth after last night's drizzle, a freshness that carried the promise of observation and careful planning. I moved slowly along the perimeter, my boots sinking slightly into the soft soil, listening to the distant chatter of birds and the faint rustle of squirrels navigating the treetops. Each step was deliberate, careful not to disturb the subtle tracks of wildlife that threaded between the fallen timber and scattered leaves. Brenda lingered near the far edge, flipping through the pages of her clipboard, the occasional glare of sunlight reflecting off the inked lines marking imaginary violations that she believed would grant authority over land that was not hers. I could hear the gentle creak of the old gate, loosened by her interference, swinging slightly with the wind, a reminder of the precision I had once applied to every hinge and bolt. The forest seemed to breathe around me, a living entity, the aroma of moss and damp bark enveloping my senses and grounding me in the reality of the land I was sworn to protect. I recalled the countless afternoons spent mapping the property, measuring every slope, every drainage line, knowing how water would run in spring and summer, how the soil would shift under seasonal changes, all recorded in careful logs that only someone intimately familiar with the terrain could interpret. As I crouched beside a splintered post, running my hand along its rough surface, I felt the connection to the labor and care of my father and grandfather, their footsteps echoing in memory, guiding my understanding of what had been disrupted. The sound of Brenda's heels on the packed dirt mingled with the whisper of leaves, a sharp contrast to the organic rhythm of the forest, and I noted the way she moved with certainty, unaware of the patterns I had learned to read over decades. From my vantage point, I could see the small creek curving through the property, its clear water reflecting the sunlight in a liquid silver thread, moving steadily over stones, reminder of the natural systems that governed this land and would continue regardless of human assertion. The air was alive with the subtle energy of insects and small mammals, the faint hum of life that persisted quietly beneath the noise of human interference, reinforcing the sense that this property had its own voice and that I was simply its careful steward. I paused, taking in the textures, the rough bark of a nearby oak, the smooth curve of moss-covered stones, the softness of fallen needles, and realized that every detail, every nuance of this environment had been catalogued in my mind, a comprehensive understanding that Brenda could not disrupt with a clipboard or temporary gestures. In that moment, I understood the delicate balance between observation and action, patience and preparation, the quiet power that comes from knowing the land so intimately that every potential outcome is anticipated, every corner accounted for, and every ripple of disturbance noted and measured. The forest, in its quiet vigilance, seemed to respond to my presence, the leaves shifting with the breeze, the sunlight flickering across the ground, and I felt the reassurance that no intrusion, however confident, could erase the connection I had nurtured with this land over decades. I took a step back from the splintered fence and let my eyes scan the surrounding forest, noting the subtle changes Brenda's actions had set in motion. The sunlight filtered through the tall pines, casting shifting patterns on the moss-covered ground, and I could hear the faint trickle of the creek weaving through the property, a steady, calming presence amid the disruption. My mind replayed the meticulous work I had invested over the years, the precise placement of fence posts, the careful leveling, the treatment of the wood to withstand seasons of rain and sun, the planting of shrubs that would help stabilize the soil along the perimeter. I had measured every angle, every depth, every distance, and now, with the fence compromised, those measurements mattered even more. I noticed tracks in the soft soil, small imprints of wildlife moving through the clearing, the subtle indication that the forest had begun to react to the open space where the barrier once stood. I considered how the natural patterns of movement, light, and water had been carefully balanced, and how Brenda's interference had created a shift that was visible if one knew where to look. I moved closer to a patch where sunlight hit a cluster of rocks, their surfaces mottled with lichen and damp from the morning dew, and examined the way the earth had settled around them, evidence of subtle erosion over the past months that I had been monitoring. Each detail was part of a larger system, one I had come to understand intimately, and each disruption now became a signal, a clue in planning the next steps. The rustling of leaves above me carried the sounds of squirrels and small birds, the soft flutter of wings occasionally striking a branch, a reminder that the life of the forest continued uninterrupted despite human actions. I crouched briefly to inspect the ground, noting where roots had shifted and where the posts had once been anchored, and I felt the rough bark of a nearby pine against my fingertips, the texture grounding me in the familiarity and resilience of this land. Brenda moved along the edge, marking notes, her voice quiet but deliberate, a cadence that echoed faintly across the clearing, unaware of the intricate web of natural balance she had altered. I focused on the sound of the creek, the faint burble over stones, the occasional plop of a fish surfacing, and allowed my mind to trace the flow of water, the way it would interact with the newly opened space where the fence had been, a pattern I could anticipate and use in careful planning. I stepped back, taking a deep breath of crisp forest air, the combination of pine, moss, and damp earth filling my lungs, and let my gaze drift over the clearing, noting the subtle shifts in light and shadow, the way the soil had compressed under the weight of recent footsteps, the faint disturbance of leaf litter, each element a silent witness to the ongoing negotiation between human intention and the enduring life of the forest. Every observation reinforced the sense that this was a land alive with memory and potential, and while Brenda's presence introduced a momentary imbalance, it was one I could measure, understand, and respond to with precision, patience, and an intimate knowledge of the property that had been nurtured and defended across generations. As the morning sun climbed higher, I settled onto a fallen log near the creek and unfolded a series of old property maps and survey records I had kept in a waterproof case. The crisp scent of paper mingled with the earthy aroma of damp soil and pine needles, grounding me in the present moment while connecting me to decades of stewardship over this land. Each map bore careful annotations from my father and grandfather, lines marking boundaries, streams, and elevations, details that Brenda could never perceive from a superficial glance. I traced the lines with my finger, feeling the grooves of ink and pencil, remembering long afternoons spent in this very clearing measuring distances, calculating angles, and recording subtle topographical changes. One particular map caught my attention, a hand-drawn overlay from the late 1970s showing the precise placement of a now-removed section of fence, accompanied by notes about wildlife corridors and natural water flow, ensuring minimal disruption to the forest ecosystem. The realization settled in that the actions taken by Brenda had unknowingly disturbed areas designated for natural movement of deer, boars, and smaller mammals, patterns that had been observed and preserved for decades. I measured the distances between fallen posts and compared them to the annotations, confirming that any temporary opening along the fence line could be transformed into an opportunity to guide the forest in its natural rhythm. The rustle of leaves overhead and the occasional call of a woodpecker punctuated the quiet, reminding me that this environment was alive, responsive, and observant. I made mental notes of the slopes, the location of rocks and low branches, and the subtle channels through which water ran, each a detail that could influence how the forest would react in the coming days. Pulling a small notebook from my backpack, I sketched a quick diagram, marking areas where natural barriers could be emphasized and where wildlife movement might interact with the temporary disruption. The sun glinted off the creek, the water flowing steadily over stones smoothed by years of rain and sediment, a consistent rhythm that I could synchronize with the patterns of activity across the clearing. I recalled the numerous hours spent tracking the behavior of wild boars, their feeding patterns, and the way they navigated the underbrush, all logged meticulously in field notes that I referenced now to understand how to harmonize human intervention with natural response. As I reviewed each annotation, the sound of Brenda moving among the trees became a background rhythm, the soft crunch of shoes on earth, the occasional snapping of a twig, entirely oblivious to the subtle systems I was interpreting and preparing to leverage. I felt the cool breeze shifting through the canopy, carrying with it the mixed sense of pine, damp earth, and faint floral notes from nearby shrubs, a sensory map of the terrain that reinforced my understanding of how light, moisture, and movement intersected across the property. The interplay of these elements, combined with the intelligence gathered from decades of observation, allowed me to see a path forward, a strategic preparation rooted in deep familiarity with the land, readying me for a careful and measured response that respected the ecosystem while addressing the temporary disturbance caused by human action. Each observation, every calculated measurement, and every recorded note converged to create a plan that was methodical, precise, and entirely grounded in the natural order of the forest. With the observations complete, I began arranging the subtle preparations that would guide the forest to respond in its own way. I marked the positions of fallen posts with small, discrete flags made from natural twine, blending with the surroundings, so that paths of movement through the opening would be clear without drawing immediate attention. I adjusted low branches and shifted small logs slightly, creating natural corridors that would subtly direct the activity of the wildlife. Each adjustment was measured, based on years of studying how animals navigate, where they prefer to feed, and how they avoid obstacles in their environment. I watched the sunlight change angles as the day progressed, highlighting areas where shadows deepened and light shimmered across the forest floor, considering how these shifts would influence movement and perception. The faint sound of Brenda checking the remaining fence line carried across the clearing, her voice a quiet monotone as she catalogued minor details, unaware of the intricate plan taking shape under her gaze. I paused to run my hands along the soil, feeling its texture, noting the moisture content and subtle shifts in elevation, recalling previous seasons when heavy rains had left channels for water and small animals alike. Each element was a signal, a variable that could influence outcomes, and I catalogued them mentally, ensuring nothing would be overlooked. I checked the placement of fallen branches again, imagining the paths through which wild boars would move, how they would interact with the temporary openings, and how the forest itself would respond to the disruption. The rustle of leaves above, the occasional tapping of a woodpecker, and the soft scurrying of unseen creatures reminded me that the land was alive, observing, and would act according to its own rules. I made small adjustments to the terrain to enhance these natural behaviors, shifting pine cones, smoothing minor dips, and ensuring that every movement would be guided without force, simply by creating conditions that would be naturally compelling. The cool air carried the scent of damp earth and pine resin, mingling with the faint warmth of sunlight on my jacket, grounding me in this space where observation, patience, and knowledge combined. I moved carefully along the perimeter, confirming the positions of natural barriers and reviewing mental notes from years of experience on how wildlife navigates the area. Each glance across the clearing reinforced the subtle orchestration I had set in motion, an invisible choreography designed to encourage the forest to respond in a way that reflected the balance and integrity I had maintained for decades. Brenda's occasional movements across the site were absorbed into the background, the sounds of her steps blending with the ambient forest noises, entirely unaware of the complex interplay of natural guidance I had prepared. As the afternoon light shifted, illuminating new angles and casting long shadows, I stepped back to review the clearing from a higher vantage point, noting how sunlight, terrain, and natural obstacles intersected to create a pathway that would be followed by the wildlife. Every detail aligned with the long-term knowledge I held about this forest, ensuring that the plan would unfold in harmony with the land, leveraging its patterns and instincts to achieve a response that was both natural and decisive, a testament to the patient stewardship and intimate understanding that had been cultivated over generations. As the late afternoon sun poured golden light through the canopy, the subtle orchestration I had prepared began to take shape. The underbrush shifted, small disturbances traveling across the clearing as if signaling the forest itself was awakening to the change. I remained behind a cluster of pines, observing, the scent of damp earth and pine resin mingling with the faint aroma of dry leaves and sunlight. Every detail I had positioned, the low branches, the gently tilted logs, the small gaps in the fallen fence, was guiding movement naturally, without force, and the forest responded in kind. I noticed the small rustle of leaves that grew louder, a hint of movement that suggested larger animals were approaching, their presence anticipated by the careful adjustments I had made. Sunlight caught on the slight sheen of animal fur moving through shadowed paths, the quiet shuffle of hooves on the soft forest floor, and the faint murmur of wind through the trees punctuating the moment with its own rhythm. Brenda's voice, calm but clipped as she catalogued her notes, became background noise, her presence unaware of the subtle mechanisms at work around her. I observed as wild boars navigated the temporary openings, nudging along fallen branches, exploring the disturbed ground, and moving with an instinctual rhythm that reflected the natural patterns I had studied and anticipated for years. Each step, each sniff, each turn followed the channels I had prepared, creating a cascade of movement that unfolded like a carefully read map of instincts and preparation. The sunlight shifted again, reflecting off wet patches of soil, highlighting areas where water would gather and influence the forest floor, subtly guiding the paths the animals would take. I could hear the creek's steady burble in the distance, a constant that harmonized with the activity in the clearing, reinforcing the interconnectedness of every element: light, soil, moisture, vegetation, and wildlife. Brenda finally paused, tilting her head as though sensing something amiss, yet her eyes did not perceive the full complexity of what was unfolding, the intricate choreography of nature responding to careful human preparation. I stayed motionless, heart steady, noting the way light glinted on pine needles, the subtle sound of leaves shifting under animal movement, and the faint scent of disturbed soil, each detail confirming the success of the preparation. From my vantage point, I could see the interplay of shadow and light guiding paths, the distribution of branches and logs channeling activity, and the way natural instincts aligned with the adjustments I had made to create a response that was subtle yet decisive. Every rustle, every shuffle, every shift in the underbrush was a signal, a payoff for the observation, patience, and understanding of the forest I had cultivated over decades. I inhaled the crisp air, feeling the weight of the land beneath my boots, the resonance of the forest as it responded in its own language, and knew that the temporary disturbance had been transformed into a natural response, harmonious, inevitable, and entirely aligned with the legacy of stewardship I had inherited and preserved. As the sun dipped toward the western horizon, casting long golden streaks through the tall pines, I stepped forward into the clearing, feeling the subtle shift in the forest that I had orchestrated come alive. The once scattered remnants of the fence now lay partially obscured by the movement of the wildlife, natural patterns flowing seamlessly through the gaps and channels I had prepared. The wild boars, moving with instinctual precision, navigated the cleared paths, their activity harmonizing with the subtle guidance of fallen logs and low branches, creating a natural barrier that reasserted the boundary of my property without a single human hand enforcing it. The air carried the mixed scents of damp pine, turned soil, and the faint musk of the forest animals, each note a reminder of the complex ecosystem thriving here, responding to the quiet interventions I had designed. I watched as Brenda paused, her clipboard dangling at her side, a look of confusion crossing her features as she observed the unexpected activity, the forest itself responding to the disturbance she had caused, each movement of the animals a silent, inevitable correction. I could feel the pulse of the land beneath my boots, the weight of generations of care and observation guiding my understanding, and the satisfaction of knowing that this response had been both natural and deliberate. The shifting light highlighted textures across the forest floor, the patterns of moss, stones, and leaf litter interplaying with the shadow of trees to create channels of movement that were entirely consistent with the instincts of the wildlife. I moved along the perimeter, noting the areas where animals adjusted to the openings, the creek reflecting the late afternoon sun and providing a cool, steady presence in the landscape, reinforcing the idea that every element, from water flow to terrain contours, contributed to the unfolding outcome. Brenda's presence, though confident, had become peripheral, a human element unable to override the intelligence embedded in the forest, as if the land itself had spoken through subtle cues, realigning the space to its natural order. I paused to take in the sounds, the rustle of leaves, the faint patter of hooves and paws, the burble of water over stones, and felt the weight of quiet triumph, the realization that patient observation, intimate knowledge, and respect for the environment had produced a resolution that required no confrontation, no external authority. Each step I took confirmed the stability of the response, the forest asserting boundaries in a way that was seamless and inevitable, every detail reinforcing the sense of control and stewardship that had been cultivated over decades. The sunlight now slanted low through the canopy, illuminating the clearing with a soft, golden glow, highlighting the subtle pathways and corridors the animals followed, and I felt the deep satisfaction of watching the property respond naturally to care and preparation. In this moment, I understood fully that true resolution does not rely on force but on foresight, patience, and harmony with the systems that endure beyond any single human interference, a reminder that stewardship, knowledge, and respect create outcomes that are both fair and inevitable, leaving a forest restored, boundaries respected, and the balance of life reaffirmed across every inch of the land.